From the News Channel 5 Network, this is MornilingLine.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MornilingLine. Nick Bear is here on a Wednesday. And as always, a good show on tap this morning. I'm going to invite you to join in the conversation. As always, you're welcome to call. We'll get the number up there in a moment. But what we're going to talk about is the situation out of Garland, Texas. The shooting there in connection with an art show, an art exhibit that was going on. As you know by now, ISIS is claiming responsibility for these two gunmen that showed up at the location there and were gunned down and killed. And a lot of issues have spawned out of this. Everything from the media coverage to, what do you think of this art exhibit where they had editorial cartoons depicting Muhammad, which certainly is something that was going to draw some attention, perhaps from extremists as it may have. And then also the after effects on the responsibility, how it applies to the Muslim community as a whole, and what Americans take from this. We're going to get into all of that this morning, take your phone calls, and also get you up to speed on the very latest with our guests to talk about it. And let's introduce them to you now. We have Paul Galloway with us this morning. He's the Executive Director of the American Muslim Advisory Council. Good morning. Nice to have you on, sir. Appreciate you coming on. And Professor Larry Burris from over at MTSU, journalism professor from there, and it's good to have you on, sir.
Good to be here.
Appreciate it. We have two individuals, that I think bring different elements to the table and some of what we're going to be covering as a whole this morning. Before I get comment from the both of you, I thought we would maybe just run the very latest piece we have this morning, just to give folks a little bit of a background on how things have played out in Texas, to kind of set the table for us. Then we'll start our discussion and get into the phone call. So let's have a look at this story right now.
It's still unclear whether Elton Simpson and Nadir Sofi were ordered by ISIS to open fire at a Prophet Muhammad cartoon contest in Texas. On Tuesday, the terror group claimed responsibility for the attack, but terror experts remain skeptical.
I really think it's a sign of weakness on ISIS's part, a reflection that they see that their momentum has slowed a bit.
Investigators are now examining the gunman's contacts and online activities. In a Twitter posting just before the attack, federal authorities say Simpson pledged allegiance to ISIS. But even before that, CBS affiliate WCCO reports Simpson began communicating with a man known as Mujahid Miski, an American reportedly fighting with the terror group Al-Shabaab in Somalia. In one exchange, Miski tweeted, "The brothers from the Hebdo attack did their part. It's time for brothers in the U.S. to do their part." Simpson tweeted back, "When will they ever learn?" The exchange references the gunman who killed 12 people at the newspaper Charlie Hebdo in January. The paper's editor is rejecting comparisons between the Paris and Texas attacks.
These people are organizing contests, anti-Islamist contests. It's an obsession. We don't have this obsession.
On Tuesday, the magazine was honored with a Freedom of Expression Courage Award in New York. Several writers boycotted the event. Edward Lawrence for CBS News, Washington.
All right, that's just kind of a brief overview. It doesn't touch on it all, but let me get to our guests, and as I said, the phone lines are open. Let me just talk with you first, Paul. It's been a few days now since this has happened. The fallout after the effect, what is it that you focus on at this point, or what is a particular concern to you?
Well, I think the very first thing that we have to say is we should really appreciate Garland PD and the police officer, who was just an absolute hero. I mean, coming under, two semi-automatic or even automatic rifles, and he's armed with a handgun, and is an off-duty traffic cop, and he saved so many lives. Mm-hmm. So before anything, I think we really have to just, especially with all the current events that are happening, mm-hmm. is take note and appreciate good police work.
Yeah.
After that, I think one of the most important things is to say that violence is never an appropriate response to speech. And the community has to be extremely clear that we're not going to tolerate or ever harbor or encourage any type of response like that. The answer to speech is more speech. Dialogue is where we should be taking these things. We live in America, and free speech is a core value for all faith communities. Without the First Amendment, we couldn't worship, right? And so I think that it's been incredibly clear. If you look at all the Muslim organizations, they've made statements condemning this. They made statements condemning Charlie Hebdo. And where the organized Muslim community, from our scholars, our religious leaders, down to our activists, we've had a united voice that says this is not what we represent, this is not what our religion teaches, and these people are unfortunately, sadly misguided souls.
You do get the sense maybe that Pam Geller, with the group that organized this exhibit, is an art exhibit depicting political cartoons displaying the Prophet Muhammad, which can be offensive to some in the Muslim community. That some of what I've heard her say after the fact is, all right, this just shows the type of threat that exists in this country. This was a free speech act. We had this art exhibit, and it drew this kind of response. This isn't Paris. This isn't Europe. This isn't somewhere in the Middle East. This is happening here. And so our free speech could be under attack by Muslims. That's kind of how I take some critics seeing this and raising a warning flag. Is that fair?
Well, I think in light of understanding that kind of claim, I'd like to say we need better champions for free speech. And what I mean by that, this is not the first time that Pam Geller has been around an actual shooting. If you remember back in 2011, just 4 years ago, Anders Breivik, the Norway bomber and shooter, killed 77 people. In his manifesto that said, explained his motives, he actually quoted Geller multiple times as one of his inspirations. So she's a person of controversy. She's been a long-time critic of the Muslim community, and she went to the very venue where there was an event that was celebrating the Prophet Muhammad and talking about the peaceful message of Islam, and she went to the same exact venue to hold this event. So in a lot of ways, I'll defend her right to do any type of speech she wants to do. But at the same time, for her to position herself as a champion of free speech, I think there's a lot more to it than just that.
Okay, and I know you're sitting next to a champion of free speech, Professor Burris. And your kind of take on this. I mean, clearly it seemed like organizing an event like this, based on what we saw that happened in France, I mean, it was going to be controversial. Your take on it and maybe how it played out.
Sure. There's a phrase I use sometimes. It was be stupid. Yeah. She has the right to do that. She has the right to do her free speech. Should she have done it is a whole other issue. She's stirring up controversy. That's what it's all about. Free speech has always been under attack. The unpopular views have always tried to be suppressed. During World War I, a couple of newspaper editors were lynched because they weren't patriotic enough. Okay, so I think you have to be careful stopping free speech. Yeah. I'd be very concerned about the government saying, no, you can't do this. If somebody wants to do hateful speech, I'll tell them how to do it, and I'll tell the other side how to protest it. Mm-hmm. So you really need, as you were saying, you really need both sides in this. You really don't want to be suppressing speech. Where does it stop?
Yeah, and where do you draw? We know there are some limits on free speech. Sure. For instance, yelling fire, the classic example in a crowded movie theater that could put people's lives at risk. And I agree with you. I'm the last person that's going to advocate censorship. And I guess no one really imagined that someone would actually show up with weapons here in this country to do what they did in Texas. But what this conference was and what this exhibit was created a real danger for people. That's where I start looking at, where do you draw the line, Professor? I mean, if I have a belief, if you tell me that we're going to have this and people are going to show up with guns and there are going to be lives lost, I'm going to take a real hard look. I'm not sure how I come down. I'm a journalist. I'm going to take a real hard look at putting some limits on this, just as I would put on limits or charge someone with yelling fire in a theater that leads to a stampede that hurts people. I mean, that's...
Without getting into gun control, what kind of security do you have at these sorts of places?
And they did hire more, didn't they?
They did hire more. So you need to keep the people with the guns out of a situation like that. You put a barrier around it. You say, unless you are registered at this event, you can't come within 50 yards, 100 yards. Mm-hmm. You're going to keep the other people away, and that would then allow the free speech. It would allow the protesters to protest outside, and both sides should be able to do it. You're absolutely right. You don't want guns at a place like this. Yeah. So there's that issue involved there, and how do you control that? And by the way, the quote on shouting fire is shouting fire in a crowded theater and causing a panic.
Right.
So that part is often left out. So there are ways of controlling the situation so there's not a panic.
So there's not a panic.
Right.
That's a good point.
The state has a responsibility to protect everybody doing free speech. Yeah. Free speech doesn't mean shooting somebody. That's not free speech.
Gotcha.
I'd like to chime in on that because I think that we also have to remember, the Constitution doesn't guarantee you the right to not be offended, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important that people who are of good conscience and who basically want to see our community be safer is for us to to kind of change the marketplace. I think that if it's not profitable, if it's not attractive to do these kind of events, I mean, anytime you want to talk about Islam and Muslims, if you can't replace it with Jew or Christian or Hindu or even a racial community and say the same thing, you probably shouldn't say it, even though you can. And I think that's the difference between, you know, what you can do and what you should do, which just comes down to wisdom.
Yeah. Now, I'm wondering, too, as you know, we've had our issues here with controversy out of Murfreesboro when they were constructing the new mosque there. And it's interesting, over the last several months, and I did a lot of stories on the new mosque going in there, it's settled down. You know, I mean, it went through the courts. The legal issues seem to be, taken care of now, and they're good citizens in that community.
And the city of Murfreesboro was still there.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And you know exactly what I'm talking about. Of course, being from MTSU. Still there, it's quiet. But I wonder now, and I have a concern about this, and being fairness, something like this happens. Sure. All of a sudden, some of those folks who were against this mosque there and the larger facility being built are worried now, wow, we saw that in Texas, and we have this big mosque. Not that that's come up yet.
Sure.
But, I mean, what would you say to folks that are like, gosh, we have a mosque here now, a big one. I remember, wasn't there a controversy there? Should we be worried?
Well, and here's the thing. That mosque actually had threats against it.
It did. Oh, and some of the equipment was firebombed when it was being built.
Exactly. So, and this is both First Amendment issues. I mean, freedom of religion, your freedom of conscience to worship as you see fit, as well as freedom of expression. Those are all under the same First Amendment clause. So one of the things that I think is really the long-term answer, and I'm going to probably say this a million times today, is that we have to build relationships. We have to have honest, frank dialogue that crosses cultural and religious boundaries so that people get to know each other. Because it's without those relationships, it's the fear of the unknown that drives it.
All right, we need to take a break on that. Now, when we come back, we'll take phone calls. Your call, 737-7587, and more with our conversation, Professor Burris from MTSU and Paul Galloway, Executive Director of the American Muslim Advisory Council. We'll be right back after this. Stay with us. We are back on Morning Line. Thanks for joining us on this Wednesday. We're talking about the after effects of the Texas shooting, the Muslim community, the questions about this art exhibit and how it all played out. With us is Paul Galloway. He's the Executive Director of the American Muslim Advisory Council. Professor Larry Burris, journalism professor over at MTSU. Thanks both for coming on. Real quickly, before we get to the phone lines, and we've got them open with some folks on hold, but just, Paul, for you, and it's a basic question that maybe just folks who don't follow this real closely want to know. Okay, well, heck, if I draw something or somehow do something with regard to the Prophet Muhammad, or, a school newspaper puts it on their front page to kind of examine the issue, and there are folks within the Muslim community that see this, what is the reaction? Will they be offended, and do you have to worry about getting shot?
So I really am glad that you gave me an opportunity to talk about this, because the Muslim community, I very often say that we get presented like a Star Trek New Generation type of thing. It's like we're thought of as the Borg, right? That we're a monolithic group that just has one response that's universal across it. In Nashville alone, we have over 40 different ethnic groups. Our community is so diverse. We have people that are politically conservative, people that are politically liberal, that just spans from business owners to refugees, right? And from PhDs that are professors down to people without a high school degree. And you can't say that one person or one response is going to be the Muslim community's response. It's such a diverse community that there's going to be a plethora of responses.
Can you explain why they take such offense to a depiction of the Prophet?
So it really depends on what branch of Islam you follow.
So it's not across the board?
In the Shia tradition, which is kind of like the Catholics of Islam, and the Sunnis would be more like the Protestants, by way of kind of hierarchy, because the Shia tradition has a kind of a different hierarchy structure for their imams. There's actually a tradition of drawing the Prophet Muhammad. The U.S. Supreme Court has a statue of the Prophet Muhammad in there as people who are luminaries of justice. There's actually a statue at the Supreme Court. Nobody's taking offense to that because it was done respectfully. Now, one of the issues is that Islam overall kind of went the way that the Byzantine Empire originally did, and they don't do iconography or they don't do images. The Bible says, no graven images, because it could be for idolatry. Right. And the birth of Islam was in a place where paganism and idolatry was rampant. Gotcha. So it's kind of a theological part from one side, and then the other part is that a lot of the scholars have said that we don't depict our prophet because we don't want any race to feel not included included in his leadership or in following him. Because if you depict him as an Arab or you depict him as black hair, all of a sudden what does that do to blonde-haired, blue-eyed people, or what does it do to black people? So a lot of the thing about Islam and depictions, some of it comes to theology, some of it comes to practicality, but I think the offense comes is when it's done in a way that's slandering our symbols. It's trying to make Muslims feel less welcome and less respected than other religions. Okay. Professor, you said during the break when we talked about it, should the campus newspaper do this? They have to be prepared to deal with the consequences.
Right. Freedom of speech is freedom with responsibility, and if you're going to do speech, then you must be willing to take the consequences. And if people want to protest and demonstrate and march, if somebody wants to try to defund the paper, for example, well, that's a government entity there. It's government funding with state funding with the paper. But again, I would tell people how to protest in a movie theater. I would talk to the theater owner about how to show a movie, and then I would tell the anti-movie people how to protest, demonstrate, to fight it off. As you were saying earlier, more speech, not less speech, is the answer. We need to have more dialogue, and that dialogue may get vitriolic at times. We may have inflamed passion at times, but I think we can still sit down or maybe stand up and yell at each other. That's fine. When you start crossing the line to action, though, that's a problem.
And do you think some of these recent incidents have had a chilling effect? I mean, I don't know. I mean, most journalists do and stick by their tenets to do what's right. But even if I was in a situation like this, I would think twice before, even if it contributed to the article, depicting it in a way that
which is self-censorship, which is not a good thing.
Exactly, it's not. Right. But I'm not saying that I wouldn't run it, but I can tell you right now, I think you're a fool if you don't think twice. Now, I hope you follow the right tenets, but I would think twice. And I can tell you, there's certainly some people out there that don't want to bother with it, and they're not going to do it.
A lot of it depends on your perspective. Okay. If we go all the way back to the Revolutionary War, Paul Revere and John Adams were saying to people, the police are coming to your town, get your guns down and shoot them. That's what Lexington and Concord were all about. And we sort of praise them. Well, you know, it's a different perspective, so we need to allow all the groups to have their perspective. We need to learn what that perspective is. As you were saying, there's a lot of misunderstanding out there. So we need to have that dialogue. We need to explain, you know, when we talk about the news people, there are people in Nashville I think you would rather not be news people you'd rather not be associated with. But what is the news person? What is the faith community? They're all a whole wide range in there. So it's wrong to say this is the Catholic community, or this is the Republican community, or we have a spokesperson for the white community or the black community. What if I don't want that spokesperson? Okay, then we need all the dialogue there. Yeah, diversity. Did you want to say something, Paul? No. Okay, let's take a phone call or two. Let's go to Joe. Joe, good morning.
Good morning, Nick.
Hey, Joe.
Seems like both the two gentlemen you have on this morning are very level-headed, and I don't know that much about the Muslim religion, but I'm listening to the gentleman and I'm learning more than I knew. But this lady, you know, I'm all for freedom of speech, but it'd be like standing around a fire and inviting a bunch of people around with gasoline cans. It could get out of hand real easy, and everybody should have known this. And if these two guys was on the radar for FBI for being kind of radical on their side, then, you know, this is just going to inflame the people. You know, I don't think, I wouldn't make fun of anybody's religion. Muhammad, drawing a cartoon of it or whatever, but some people might. But when you do that, you need to expect what could follow. I mean, somebody could be very well offended by standing by watching this. So this, you know, you got to be careful about what you do and say nowadays, and you know, it's just everybody. You know, every religion has their right to do what they, you know, see to do, but don't try to inflame something that's already a big issue overseas, and if it keep going, could get to be a big issue here.
Yeah. I mean, well, again, that I don't know if he's leaning toward then. You said earlier, Professor, clearly they knew this could be an issue. That's why they brought in more security. You say it's the government's role to say, look, we have to accept and allow this free speech, just like how we have Klan rallies sometimes. It's been a long time, thankfully, but there's extra security out there to ensure that they're allowed to march and spew their hate, but they're allowed to, and there's law enforcement out there to protect both sides, right?
The part of the problem, though, is as we're tracking those two people, for example, how did the FBI find out about them? They're monitoring phone calls. This is a whole other topic, obviously.
Yeah, sure.
Do we want the security services, the FBI or whoever, monitoring everybody's phone call on the chance that one of the people they catch may have some harm in mind? There are ways of protecting the speech. We can put a police cordon around. Do we want police visiting every rally and demonstration and event here in Nashville? I don't think so. So where's that line between protecting and going too far?
Yeah, it is true. It's incredible, and you can go back to the horrible bombings of the World Trade Towers. How quickly Americans who love our freedoms are willing to give up their civil liberties when they're scared.
Sure.
And let's just talk about the Patriot Act, shall we? I mean, that's my take on it. I mean, you're too quick sometimes to just say we'll trade our civil liberties and our privacy for security. And when you start going down that path, it's a problem, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
And, let's go next to Donnie. Hi, Donnie.
Hello.
Good morning, Donnie. What's on your mind?
I got a question. It may not be right or may be wrong. I don't know.
Sure.
But, I mean, they shouldn't kill anybody just for what they draw. And these ISIS people, they got on these online computers. I think if you're online to computer with ISIS or anything like that, the police need to check them out thoroughly and stop them before they start.
Yeah. Well, talk a little bit, if you would, then, Paul, about ISIS and the role they play, because we hear about some of these radicalized Muslims in this country that then all of a sudden start making contact with this group. Right. And it scares people.
So I'd like to actually start by saying I personally don't call them ISIS because I don't think they're Islamic, and they call themselves Islamic State. Actually, the Arab world calls them Daesh, which means people of destruction. And it sounds like ISIS in Arabic, Daesh. And it's a slander for them. And they've been rejected in almost every way. They've been rejected from the top scholars of Islam universally all the way down. And what's interesting is they've actually put a hit on a local, and he's actually one of America's most influential scholars. He's a Rhodes teacher. His name is Yasser Qadhi. He lives in Memphis. And he's got a Yale PhD in Islamic Studies. And he's been so outspoken against Daesh, against these terrorists, that they actually, in their last magazine, put his picture and said it's an act of worship to kill him. And this made big news last month, actually. And so this shows where the American Muslim community, by and large, is when it comes to this issue of these terrorists. In fact, our prophet warned us about people. There's an Arabic word called Khawarij, and it means basically extremists. And he said that the people like this, the Khawarij, that they're the dogs of the hellfire. And when he described them, he said outwardly they look religious. They have long beards, they wear thobes, but when they recite the Quran or holy book, that it doesn't go past their throat. And what that means is that they don't grasp the meaning of it. There's no heart in it. It's just that they're using the religion for their own ends.
And what are their ends? What is it they really want?
When I look at ISIS or Daesh, when you look at them, they're doing all sorts of things that just go 100% against Islam. Not alone just the terrorism, the massacres, the persecution, destroying, historical artifacts. They actually sell drugs. They trade in all these things that are just no faith community would ever embrace. And it seems to me that they are pretty much a power-hungry cult trying to establish not just a state, but a domination over people. They kill as many Muslims, if not more Muslims, than anybody else. And if you don't declare allegiance to them, if I was there in the Middle East, in their area, they would murder me in a second, because if I called them Daesh, that was enough right there for me to be gone.
All right, on that note, we'll take a break. The number is 737-7587. If you want to jump in, questions or comments this morning as we talk about spanning from the Texas shooting, some of the fallout, and as you've heard here in our conversation to this point, the media's role, which we're going to get more into in the coverage of this, as well as questions you may have on the Muslim community and their reaction to all this, especially locally here, where we have many of them living among us. So let's take a break and be back with more right after this. Stay with us. We are back on Morning Line. Thanks for joining us. As you see, talking about the fallout from the Garland shooting in Texas and the role of ISIS, the art exhibit they had there, and what maybe spurred this attack. Professor Larry Burris is with us from MTSU. Paul Galloway, Executive Director of the American Muslim Advisory Council. Yeah, Professor Burris, that last caller, it did sound to me like he was maybe suggesting that the FBI monitor anyone who may go online to go to one of these ISIS websites, which they can use as a recruiting tool. But you said some of your own students may need to do so out of, for academics.
If there's a site out there that is a hate site, and they are there, we need to know how to fight them off. And you need to know what is it they're saying, and you need to look at some of those sites are fantastic sites in terms of design, in terms of advertising, in terms of sucking people in. Those are marvelous sites, how they do that, and we need to see how those groups are working, and the only way to do that is to go there, visit the sites, and I don't know that we want the FBI tracking all our movements.
Everyone who looks.
Like
now,
that.
you would imagine the FBI and others in government are probably very closely monitoring these sites, which they certainly should be doing, right?
Sure, absolutely.
But again, having Big Brother over your shoulder monitoring, especially when you have students that are not doing so to become radicalized.
But where does that monitoring stop?
Yeah, I know. That's always the question.
And I think this is an important thing to talk about, is that there's a difference between like racial profiling and behavioral profiling. And if you have a behavioral matrix of having certain things that add up, that you could be someone who would become violently extreme, not just extreme in ideology, but literally actionable to oppressing or trying to force your opinions on other people, that is a whole matrix of things. It's not just visiting a site, right? So, like for instance, one of the shooters, he was arrested in the past for lying to the FBI. So he had done some behavioral thing to get on their radar. And so I would very strongly caution that we shouldn't just say, these sites shouldn't be monitored. They absolutely should be. But there should be a matrix, and there is a matrix, and sometimes it needs to be massaged, and it needs to be a little flushed out, maybe some more oversight from the public and different groups to make sure we're not abusing people's privacy. But there has to be a solid way for our law enforcement and the agencies that protect us in order to do their jobs effectively. And quite honestly, the fact that we haven't had a major terrorist attack at the scale of 9/11 speaks to the good job that the FBI is doing. I mean, we had the Boston massacre, which is horrific, and that's actually very representative of what these two shooters did. These people have a cell phone with 5 or 6 different apps that can communicate and text internationally,
right?
And it makes it extremely hard to monitor someone who's being radicalized. And what law enforcement is saying is it used to take a year to take someone from being a disgruntled person to doing something horrible, and now the time is getting compressed into months. So the challenge for law enforcement is really hard, and what is really hard for us as a Muslim community, especially me as an activist, to try to balance, how do we protect liberty for all Americans, yet still empower the agencies that are going to protect us to do their job effectively. And it's not a simple question.
It's not at all. By the way, when you look at the 2 individuals that were shot and killed in Texas that kind of went out there with the weapons to do whatever they planned on doing, do you look at them as being, because we're trying to determine now whether or not they actually had direct contact with this organization, ISIS, or what did you call them?
I call them Daesh.
Daesh. Yeah. And whether or not they were receiving orders there, or if perhaps there, as we see more cases of maybe some radicalized Americans, if these are folks that are just disenfranchised in this country and upset about whatever's happened here, and maybe they don't fully understand what the message is from there, and then they just see something like this and act on their own. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, as a community, honestly, in a lot of ways, whether they were directly recruited by ISIS or they were fanboys who became actionable on their own, it almost, at that point, doesn't matter. The fact is that we weren't able to inoculate them, to let them understand the religion in the proper way, that they would never even go down this route. Yeah. And that's something that we kind of have to collectively work on. And it's not something the Muslim community can do on its own. It requires those law enforcement relationships. It also requires with us building a more civil society. When you make a young person who feels disenfranchised, and then all of the coverage about his religion and all he sees about Muslim countries is just violence, extremism, and people are telling him he's evil because of the religion he was born into and he follows, that just kind of helps the radicalization process, because the narrative from Daesh and all these terrorist groups is that Islam and the West are at war. And the narrative that Pamela Geller and people like her is that Islam and the West are at war. So in my mind, a lot of times, these kind of provocateurs they actually are the flip side of terrorists because they're reinforcing the narrative. And what's interesting about it is neither side really has trained scholars in Islamic sciences. Most of the terrorist recruiters do not have degrees in Islamic studies from reputable universities, and they're always outside of the consensus of Muslim scholars. Most of the people who are constant critics of Islam don't understand the religion, don't speak Arabic, and have no credentials to really talk about the faith.
Okay, then I wonder then too about the media's background and the role in covering some of this. You know, I don't know what kind of coverage the promotion was given for this event in Texas prior to this. Was there much?
No.
Did the media cover it because of the controversy? How did the word get out and it was even going on? Did they have flyers up on phone poles? I don't know.
They only had 200 people in attendance.
They only had a few people in there, but somehow the word got out enough and it spread. But then you can talk about some more high-profile images. We were going to touch on this back in 2011. Pastor Terry Jones and the whole issue about his little podunky little church with just a few members, and he made national headlines, got the U.S. government involved when he was going to burn a Quran. Now, again, we reported on this clown and blew it up more. So where does the media responsibility come into play?
There's a concept called a pseudo-event, which is a non-event that we in the media make into an event. And it's one of those things that we feel we have to cover it. If somebody says that they're going to go burn a Quran, we in the media feel that we have to cover that.
And they're saying it knowing we're going to be there.
Exactly right. Exactly. If we didn't show up, then they wouldn't do the event. But on the other hand, if it's part of the news, it's part of the society, so we've got to show up for that. And it's a hard call.
This case is a really interesting one because he had 30 people in his congregation.
Like I said, small.
And we empowered him to the point where the Joint Chiefs of Staff actually made a personal phone call to him to negotiate with him if he's going to do it or not.
Yeah.
And this is exactly the same media responsibility that comes when, basically, if it bleeds, it leads. A terrorism event is always going to be headlined for multiple days, but good things that the Muslim community do may not make the news at all, or the condemnations. And one of the things that I hear all the time is how come we don't hear the Muslim community speak out against these things? Yeah. And I can tell you, I've spent over a decade speaking out against these things.
Sure you have.
And it's extremely hard to get the voice out at the same level that the amplification of the horrible event happens.
I know, that's tough. I wonder what you think. You know that group, is it the Westboro Church, or what was that group that would come out sometimes at soldiers' funerals and the parades, and they'd come back? Listen, I made this call on my own. I may have discussed it with the news director, but at one point we knew that one was showing up somewhere. And we went, and they were part of the scene. And I made the call right there. I'm not going to show that they're here unless it becomes an issue. Meaning, if there was an attack or they were fighting or whatever. But I covered the funeral. I didn't show it, Professor. I left it out because I didn't think it brought anything to the story. Because they ended up getting a spot where they could stand, and everyone just ignored them. There was no violence. Now, if there had been any violence, or if they had run out, I would have had to cover it. But the fact that they were there alone, I just ignored it. And I don't know if you're saying that's exclusion, but you know what? I wasn't going to give them to them. I didn't show them.
If you want to do that, that's great. Yeah. And I'll tell you better how to do it. If the government does it, that's a different issue. So again, it's that social responsibility.
What do you mean? If the government?
Well, if you don't want to cover it, that's fine. Don't cover it.
Unless it becomes part of the story.
But if the government says that you can't cover it, or the government says they can't be there, that's a whole other issue. And again,
we make calls every day on what we cover.
Absolutely.
Excellent point. And that's the concern on whether or not you're being told what to do. Do you think we're going in that direction to any degree?
Yes. I think that.
What do you think is happening?
I think that there's a fear is growing out there that if we cover this, the government are going to be watching, or if we attend this meeting, the government may be watching us. I think there's kind of a generalized fear out there that Big Brother is there, and that's come from 9/11. You mentioned earlier, how much of our civil liberties are we willing to give up in order to be safe? And I think we've given up a lot of them. That's part of what's going on.
But when you say that, are you speaking of the media and media professionals, or are you speaking of society in general, or both? Because the reason I ask is I think it's responsible reporting when there's a mass shooting.
Sure, absolutely.
Not to talk about the name of the person, not to promote that person. There's been so many cases in mass shooting events where there's copycats and people that get expired because you take a little dweeby kid who did something horrible and you lionize him, make him a hero, and then you endanger the society more.
Right. That's why you don't cover or bomb scares at schools.
Right. Even though of late we've had some locally because it was epidemic proportions.
Sure.
But no, you're right. It has to reach a certain level. Or suicides. Things like this. You don't want to encourage someone else. I'm kill myself, I make the news.
Right. So during a typical day, I bet that you are not going to do a story about 80 planes landing safely at Metro. You're not going to do that story. Right. But when you hear on the scanner that a plane may be in trouble, I bet your satellite truck is out there right away just in case. Now, you may not show the crash.
Right.
But that sort of situation has happened, but you have to be there. And if you're going to expend that sort of money getting there, the bean counters, the accountants are going to want to know, you spent all this money, what do you have to show for it? Right. Well, you were there just in case. That isn't going to work. No. You're going to need to show something on the evening news why you were there, and it's going to be promoting that particular event.
Take a break on that note. When we come back, our final segment with our guests. We take some of your calls if you'd like to jump in the conversation right after this. Stay with us. All right, we are back on Morning Line. It's our final segment this morning, talking about the aftermath of what happened in Texas. As you see on the screen there, fallout from the Garland shooting and the Muslim faith and the community here as a whole and how we react to it. With us is Paul Galloway, Executive Director of the American Muslim Advisory Council, and Professor Larry Burris from over at MTSU, both of you following this. I mean, it's pretty safe to say this is not going to be the last event on American soil where this kind of thing happens. I mean, right now I'm wondering what Pam Geller has scheduled next.
Well, you can look at New York. She actually has ads that she had to sue New York Metro to put on the buses that are incredibly inflammatory, to the point where the Jewish community in New York, a large section of rabbis came together, put counter ads up and said, you don't represent us, because the ads were about the Israel-Palestinian conflict and basically said that Islam and Muslims as a religion of savages.
So again, what the rabbis did is what the solution is.
Exactly.
I mean, you don't want, I mean, she sued and won to be allowed to put those up, which I think was probably right, correct?
She has the right to do that, sure.
She has the right, but the rabbis then, to counter-protest, to put up their own is what it has to be.
More speech.
What's that?
More speech.
More speech.
More speech every time is what it has to be.
And quite honestly, people like that do this type of thing as a modus operandi, they won't do it when the marketplace doesn't want it. And I think that our goal as a civil society is to build relationships to where we honor and respect each other mutually, enough to where it's not profitable for someone to put these ads on buses, because then it should be shunned. We don't say the N-word for good reason. Now, it's not that it should be illegal, but it's actually just terribly offensive, and there's a big history there. And when we get to that point where we can mutually respect all the groups in America without going down this path of politically correctness where we can't express ourselves, but just having a genuine value of each other, I think that's the goal. And it's a long process. It's going to take time. What
do you think about here in Tennessee? As you said, you moved here from Texas, correct? Right. And you've been here now about 8 months, and I know you've met a lot of people. I mean, what do you feel or get the sense of the feelings are here among those in this community with regard to the Muslims and the mosque and all that? And I know you live out there in Murfreesboro, so you see it. And like I said, the controversy's died down. But I mean, did you have any observations to this point, Paul, on the tolerance and how it stands?
Middle Tennessee is a great place. It's very diverse. People here get it, and they come together. Just a couple weeks ago, West End Synagogue had a bullet shot through their front door, landed literally feet away from the rabbi's office. And last week, we had a vigil where Muslims, Hindus, Jews, Baha'is, Christians, all were in West End Synagogue, united in faith against violence. To stand by our friends, our co-religionists, and let them know that it's unacceptable to go to this area. My organization has multiple statements that have mosques across the state condemning bigotry against religious groups, not just Muslims. In fact, one of the first things I did when I moved here, there was a guy in Kentucky who had a writing campaign for Senate that said, "With Jews, you lose." And we actually got every mosque in Middle Tennessee, Memphis, and the Muslim community in Knoxville all to sign on a statement that said this is unacceptable, that there should never be targeting of people because they're ethnic or faith group.
What do you think changed then? And that's great in terms of, as I said, the controversy over the mosque in Murfreesboro died down. And what do you think changed? Is it because all of a sudden they lost in court and it just went away? Thankfully, there have been no more acts of vandalism.
They lost in court, and the representatives of the anti-Muslim group realized they had lost, and what are they going to do next? Picketing and protesting wasn't going to do any good. I think most of the public, most people didn't care one way or the other. It's another church. It's another
church. There's a church right next door.
There's a church on every corner of Murfreesboro.
Yeah, right.
So it was really, for most people, it was really no big deal. But again, because of 9/11 and because of the fear, the general fear of the Muslim community, well, it's going to become a hotbed of terrorism, and people allegedly found all sorts of links. It's easy to say that.
Yeah.
But again, you know what? Just this legislative session, we had 2 bills that directly targeted the Muslim community.
That's right. What was it? One was
the no-go zone bill.
No-go zone bill, which would have...
basically said that someone could complain to the Attorney General that an area is under control of a faith community or a gang, and that the Attorney General can break it up. And the interesting thing about this no-go zone bill is when pundits on Fox actually mentioned this, they said they existed in England and in Paris. They basically apologized 4 times, and the Prime Minister of the UK called the guy who said it an idiot, because he said Birmingham, or with London, I mean England's second city, was totally Muslim. Now the Muslim percentage there is huge; it's 20%. Okay. But you know, he was basically misrepresenting the entire thing as a myth. And it was disproven that there's these so-called no-go zones. But here in Tennessee, we have legislation to prevent them, even though they're not here. Yeah. Another bill, which actually is a bill that we support, is that it allows for forfeiture of assets in the case of terrorism. The issue we had with the bill in its initial drafting was that there was not a clear standard of guilt or association for properties to be seized. And it can be rife, you know, if some right-wing extremist goes to a Baptist church, makes a phone call, and then blows something up, the church could be seized. And so we want to see good laws that have checks and balances in it. But the original bills were by the same people who did the anti-Sharia bill in 2011, the Murfreesboro state senator. Yeah,
so that's still out there. That keeps coming, and I guess then when you see these things come up, they haven't moved forward, but they're going to keep coming up at this point. I mean, I'll tell you this: you talk to the sheriffs that follow, you know, look, these mosques and the people that, you know, complain and worry about them. If there was even a hint of something going on there, they would be all over it. The TBI would be in there. They would be investigating if there was, and there just hasn't been. There hasn't been.
Tonight, the TBI is doing an active shooter workshop in the mosque in Jackson.
Okay.
Tonight.
Really?
Yeah, and we have quarterly meetings with the FBI and TBI across the Muslim community.
And they monitor, but like they would do anything else. Or if there are complaints or whatever, you look into it, and nothing is. Are you kidding? You think the media would be all over that if they could find any terrorist link to any of these groups?
Of course.
Here, whatever they may be, there just hasn't been. Do you think there could be some big cover-up?
Do you really want the FBI monitoring your mosque, though? Do you want to infiltrate the mosque?
I mean just anything. If there were complaints.
Sure. Well, you know, going back again to our civil liberties, do we want the FBI infiltrating or participating in every group out there? Where does it stop?
No, you're right. You don't want them to do that.
You don't want that, but then how do you be secure? How do you find the bad guys but not harm the good guys?
Well, and I'd just like to speak logically to the fear of it all. If you believe in the Constitution and you're a patriot, it's really hard to imagine how less than 1.5% of the population can take over. Right? I mean, just the Muslim community across America is about 1.2 to 1.5% of our population. Here in Middle Tennessee, it's about 1.2% at the highest estimates. And this idea that there's going to be some kind of conspiracy of Sharia takeover, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, how could 1% take over a country, especially when you have the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause that quite honestly says nobody can do that.
Right.
You know, those things... It's playing, I call it opposition politics. I think bottom feeders do that when they don't have a lot of proactive, positive things to offer. Then they go to fear-mongering.
Yeah, it's the fear-mongering aspect of it. And then again, the media has to be responsible when they hear these things.
Sure.
Is it our role to see and determine if we think something's fear-mongering? I guess we need to determine if there's any substance to what is being said.
Right.
As opposed to just blindly reporting it.
Right. And also, there are communities that do enforce their own rules. There are churches throughout Tennessee that if you do the wrong thing, they will shun you. Is that violating the Constitution? You know, so again, there are lots of faith communities that have sets of rules within those communities, and they just do what they do. And we don't seem to have a problem with those. But if a Muslim community wants to enforce their particular rules, that seems to be a problem. We see that as an issue, but we let other groups enforce their rules.
Yeah.
And by the way, our sermons are open houses. People can come listen to what we talk about. They're Fridays, normally at noon. Right now, 12 and 1. And in fact, the mosque in Memphis that has the scholar that I was talking about, Yasser Qadhi, he streams his sermons on the internet. Anyone can log in and watch it.
Yeah.
And we let people come in all the time to observe our prayers. And really, if people want to get to know our community, we would say welcome.
I wonder if that exhibit in Texas had been something that was just very blasphemous with regard to, say, Christianity. You know, you remember, it wasn't years ago, it was an exhibit in Cincinnati where some artist had put like crucifix in a jar of urine. Yeah. Do you remember that? And it upset a lot of people. Again, it was free speech art.
It was despicable.
Yeah, but again, you know, there would have been, I don't know. I mean, some people may say, well, if there was something like that in Texas, would someone have shown up with guns to start shooting?
They shouldn't have shown up with guns, but they should have shown up to protest. And again, I will tell the artists how to do their blasphemous exhibit, and I will tell the people who are opposed, here's what you've got to do to march and protest.
Right.
And on that note, I think it's really important to know that the imams in our community, the community leaders, we very often deconstruct ISIS ideology and let our community know how these things don't jive with our religion. And I think that's why, like, for instance, Yasser Qadhi was targeted by them, because he's been such an influential, outspoken critic of them that he's been able to limit their influence.
What would you do if, as you travel about and meet with the folks within the community that you work with, you came across someone you thought was being radicalized?
I would turn them in.
Well, I mean...
No, literally, if someone is making threats, saying they're going to do something, the first thing I'm going to do is call.
If there are threats. Okay, what if it hasn't gotten to that role yet, but you can see there's maybe a young man who you're worried about, and he's talking, and not making threats, but talking about how he's intrigued by what he sees, and sees what he believes are wrongs or whatever.
And this is where I think more speech is definitely the answer. There is not a space for disgruntled youth to really talk about these things, because a lot of the mosque leaders are so worried about being castigated as being radical when they address these topics, right? So one of the new things that is happening is youth leaders and scholars are starting to sit down and have these conversations with our youth so that we can hear from them and we can actually address it.
Yeah, maybe.
And there's actually been cases where families call the mosque saying, I'm worried about my kids, and we set up a mentoring program with Islamic scholars to make sure that these people get the real information. And there's even been cases where law enforcement and Islamic scholars work together to make sure someone doesn't go down the path of radicalization.
Yeah, just to be aware of it, not ignore it. And I imagine there are warning signs or red flags that maybe you can pick up on. Sometimes there are, sometimes there aren't. Depends if they're in that community. Listen, Paul Galloway, thank you for coming on this morning. I really appreciate it. Executive Director of the American Muslim Advisory Council. And as always, it is a pleasure having Professor Burris on. He comes on and over at MTSU. Thank you for coming on, sir. It's good to see you again. We'll take a break, come back with a programming note about tomorrow right after this. Stay with us. Thank you, guys. All right, that is a wrap this morning. Our thanks to Paul Galloway, Executive Director of the American Muslim Advisory Council, and of course, Professor Larry Burris, MTSU journalism professor, talking about all this. We'll follow it. We got a few phone calls. I don't know how you feel about it. I think in general, these days, people have more and less tolerance. Here in Tennessee, it seems to me that things have settled down, as I said, with regard to the mosque. There in Murfreesboro, there had always been one. They just built a new one. And the people I've met out there are good people. And I think they fit right in, and whatever controversy there was, it's gone away, and they've become contributing good members of the community there. Look, we monitor it. If things go south, we're on it. But the bottom line is, I think as long as we remain transparent and discuss these things and don't get violent, we can hedge off any of these incidents like what happened in Texas. And the truth is, there's going to be other displays just like that. And free speech counts for a lot. The main thing is being prepared if and when someone shows up with a gun. And I agree with the first comment from Paul that law enforcement there in Texas did a fantastic job dealing with that situation. Fantastic job. The big interview now will be talking to the police officer who took those two guys out. Folks, back tomorrow, same time, same place. Open phones Thursday, whatever you want to talk about. We'll see you then, everyone. Bye-bye.